Is the future of Buddhism completely hopeless? Is it more or less hopeless than it seems? I'd always get complaints when I'd open my videos talking about myself, my academic background, my research background, and so on. They say, why do you talk so much about yourself in your videos? But for me, it's really weird to open a video like this without telling people a little bit about myself and how many years I was involved in Buddhism, that I was a scholar of Buddhism, that I lived in Buddhist monasteries, that I studied the ancient scriptural language called Pali, Bali 1, which is really the only language we have the teaching of the Buddha extant in, not Sanskrit. If I don't say something about the years and years I put into Buddhism in Sri Lanka, Cambodia, Laos, Thailand, if I don't say something, then I'm just some bald guy on the internet. Although baldness really does qualify you to have an opinion in Buddhism, let me tell you. Based on appearances right now. Yeah, gee, I didn't even realize that. Putting on this jacket, I might look like I know something about Buddhism. Look, I have one supporter and longtime follower on YouTube and Patreon, and he really lost faith in Buddhism because of the critique offered on my channel. He should start his own YouTube channel and tell his own story in his own terms. And look, dude, I'm not even saying you should come on camera with your own face. You can do animation. You can draw stick figures. You know what I mean? You can use hand puppets. There are lots of ways to tell your story on YouTube without ruining your life the way I have, but putting your personal identity on camera. But anyway, it is a dramatic story that the videos on my channel really led him to start asking serious questions about supernatural elements of Buddhism and ethical elements too, and a lot of what's said about meditation. What's ironic is that when he talks to me now, I seem like I'm way more optimistic about the future of Buddhism than he is. He seems like from his perspective, Buddhism is just as hopeless as Islam, just as hopeless as Christianity or Judaism, or more so. And we all know, in some sense, Buddhism is different. And this video is going to question how or how much. What are the prospects for the future of Buddhism this way? And maybe my answer is a little bit different than it would have been a couple of years ago in the recent past. We are right now packing up to leave for Taiwan. We literally have suitcases on the floor, just off camera. I do not think I will get involved with any Buddhist temple or any Buddhist organized religion when I'm there. I do not think I will get involved with any Taoist temple or any organized religion there. But I could. It's not unthinkable. I have some interests in common with those people. There's some common ground. Something like ecological activism, vegan activism, animal rights activism, even pro-democracy activism, and anti-communist activism. I could have those things in common with people who are part of organized Buddhist groups today, or in theory, even Confucian groups. Confucianism is not as big as Taoism in Taiwan. There is some common ground to be built on there, okay? When I first got involved with Buddhism, Theravada Buddhism, I met a man who was a Sinhalese immigrant to Toronto, so still in Canada. This is before I left for my many years living in Asia. And I remember what he said was that he felt totally disgusted with the authoritarian attitudes of the Buddhist monks. This is a really interesting point. This seems shallow, but if you've been involved with Buddhism for a few years, this actually cuts really deep. Now, he spoke English as a second language, so I'm really paraphrasing and restructuring the point he made, but it was a good point, even if he couldn't state it clearly in English. What he had to say was that when you actually read the original philosophical scriptures in the Pali Canon, they're in an open-ended, skeptical dialogue format. People cross-examine each other, they doubt each other, they debate things, and then they come to conclusions. And, you know, he sees this as the essential defining feature of Buddhism as a religion and Buddhist philosophy, okay? So the story of Noah's Ark is not in that format. The story of Noah's Ark does not invite doubt and cross-examination and disagreement and debate and so on. It tells you this is the truth. It doesn't really say it directly in the case. Either you believe it or you don't and you go to hell. The story of Noah's Ark, the story of Moses, fighting against the Egypts, escaping from Egypt, fighting against the Egyptians, the story of Jesus on the cross. If this were true, though, if really the defining essential element of Buddhism as philosophy were open-ended, skeptical dialogues of this kind, then obviously the religion would have continued to progress over time, and it didn't. It ossified right at the start during the lifetime of the Buddha. It came to one set of fixed conclusions, and that was it. Game over. Now, why is that? This is what almost nobody will be honest with you about. The reason is very simply that the authors of the ancient scriptures, they did not have the concept of hallucination as something different from real experience. So that whole corpus of scriptures is based on the concept people engage in highly rational, skeptical, philosophical dialogues, and then sooner or later they come to an understanding, or some of them end acrimoniously, but that the fundamental truth of Buddhism would be self-evident to people as soon as they had these hallucinogenic experiences. That they would hallucinate, they would see the same things the Buddha saw, they would see the same things that other Buddhist monks saw, and then they would know the truth. Now, whether you think of this as a kind of guided meditation or kind of hypnosis experience, or, I mean, it's just the fact that most people in their dreams and in their hallucinations, they see the things they expect to see. We, believe it or not, remembering one specific dialogue with the Buddha where he's being asked by a skeptical follower, why is it that I had this hallucination and I could see the gods, but I couldn't hear what they were saying? This kind of thing. It's very, very clear these people absolutely believed in hallucination. So, parallel history. If really this was about skeptical dialogue and open inquiry, and if still today that was what Buddhist monks said they stood for, they said, look, we're part of a tradition that began with the Buddha asking tough questions, the Buddha rejecting blind faith in Hinduism, blind faith in the Vedas, blind faith in the authority of what everyone's grandparents had believed in, and said, no, we're starting from scratch. We're asking all the fundamental questions. We're asking, what is the meaning of life? How was the world created? What's the creation of the universe? We're going to start a whole new religion here. We're going to reject all the preconceived notions of our ancestors, and we're going to come to new conclusions through philosophical dialogue and inquiry. That's a great story. And it's partly true. I mean, it is partly true. That's why it's such a compelling narrative. But if that had been what Buddhism was about at the time of its founding, and it had continued to be what it's about today, nobody in Buddhism would believe that the earth is flat. Nobody would believe that there are demons. Nobody would believe that they could communicate with gods and angels. Nobody would believe that hell and heaven are real places you can go after you die, so on and so forth. And these two narratives, the narrative of Buddhism as philosophical dialogue and the narrative of Buddhism as faith, they compete in one and the same place and one at the same time. There was a very moving autobiographical account I read about 6 years ago of a Buddhist nun in Malaysia. And so she wrote this herself. It was from her own perspective. And she was trying to help a man, and it's written in very careful, compassionate terms. She was trying to help a man whom she obviously regarded as insane. And this man was seeing demons and seeing ghosts of dead people. I don't remember if he saw angels or gods, like if he saw more benevolent apparitions also. And some other Buddhist monk might have encountered this man and said, oh, like you're naturally gifted with clairvoyance. Or, oh, wow, you're seeing exactly the stuff that's in the scriptures. Oh, great. Some other Buddhist monk might have affirmed his idea that these were real things he was seeing. And this Buddhist nun, she was taking the approach of trying to explain to the man that he was having extreme mood swings. He was having kind of extreme anger and extreme dejection, extreme depression. And he was seeing these things because of his own emotional state. And she was kind of taking baby steps and trying to get across to him the concept that he was seeing things that were not real. Of course, we don't know the whole story about why that guy was hallucinating as wildly as he was, but obviously the particular hallucinations he had, so they're all culturally programmed, what it is you see and what it is you think you see. But that scenario has the Buddhist monk debunking Buddhism for the sake of Buddhism, right? So the question of, can Buddhism have a future. I don't think it comes down to something as cynical as cherry picking the ancient sources. I think that's the problem, and that's not the solution. I think that basically there's a difference between looking at the historical sources and accepting them as a monument to that time and that moment in history, and then regarding, in a sense, the book as closed on that, right? So, I mean, you guys know this with me. I do have some respect for the historical figure of Socrates. But Socrates neither asks nor answers most of the ethical questions I'm interested in, most of the political questions I'm interested in. Do you know of any source in which Socrates is opposed to slavery? I don't. I mean, it's possible. There's a lot of... But I've never seen anything refer to Socrates standing up and saying slavery is immoral and it's wrong. All right? Now, do you know of any source in which the Buddha stands up in ancient India and says he's opposed to slavery? Well, I have actually looked at all the passages in the canon that mention slavery. There are definitely some kind of satirical, social commentary passages that are indeed heaping scorn on the institution of slavery. But no, the religion doesn't stand for the abolition of slavery. You could say more there's a kind of... shrewd awareness that slavery is a bad thing that kind of gets talked about and dealt with in passing here and there. But that's very different, isn't it? So, in the same sense that nobody would look to these ancient texts really with the answers to modern questions, the question becomes, is it possible to look back at those texts and say, okay, today we're going to stand for the same higher principle that they stood for. Just as the Buddha in his own time rejected the crass ignorance of ancient Hinduism. He rejected sacrificing cows. He rejected starving yourself. He rejected drinking the milk from only one nipple of the cow while fasting. It's really bizarre ancient Hindu rituals that we get described in detail in the Pali Canon, by the way. We rejected, animal sacrifice was a huge part of Hinduism at that time. The elite level of the Hindu religion that kings were part of. And he rejected, most shockingly, the authority of the Vedas. And he rejected the beliefs of his own parents and grandparents and his whole society and said, I'm starting something new, and I'm starting with these fundamental questions. Very obviously, in our time, most of the beliefs, most of the tenets he arrived at through that inquiry, an inquiry that included hallucination and believing in hallucinations as real. It's a bedrock assumption throughout the Pali Canon. Most of the answers he came to are things that we would reject today. So the only thing that remains for us is to valorize the questioning itself. The questioning, the rebellion, the idea of standing up as a man of principle. I think the Buddha does, fairly enough, embody that and so on. The idea of striking out and taking your own way rather than respecting established authority and tradition in little things and in great. And in a lot of ways, what I've just described is the same kind of respect we can have for Socrates. Socrates was wrong. Socrates was wrong about a lot of things. Socrates was guilty of the crimes he was charged with. Sorry, that's a topic for another video. There's not a lot I would agree with Socrates on if he came through a time machine and we're sitting here talking today, right? But there's a question of method. There's the defiance, the principle, the questioning, the coming to conclusions. There's that he represents. So, yes, there is potential for Buddhism to become a good and an even great religion. Not in the distant future, but right here and now. It can happen lickety-split. Most of the Buddhist intellectuals I ever knew believed exactly the same things I did. They were just at varying degrees of denial about it. You can't study these texts and actually believe. Go to any temple in Thailand, and they have the statues depicting people being tortured in hell. It's like, is this your religion? Do you go around preaching to people, if you do this, you're going to be reincarnated in hell, where you're going to be forced to climb a giant tree with iron spikes that pierce your body. And yes, I've seen statues very accurately depicting what that experience is supposed to look like. Do you actually believe that the Buddha spoke to Indra? Do you actually believe that the Buddha walked through the mountains and spoke to a yeti named Suchiloma? All these supernatural things. You could believe he could shoot lasers out of his hands and his eyes and all the crazy miracles in there. Is that what you believe in? Is that what you want your children to believe in and your grandchildren to believe in? Do you want your children performing these religious rituals? Well, the challenge ahead for Buddhism, as hard as that may sound, it's a lot easier than even sitting down with a circle of Jewish rabbis and saying, look, guys, circumcision, cutting off part of the penis, it's got to end. And it's got to end now. And here's why. That's a conversation that's very, very hard to have. It's basically impossible for anyone to sit down in Islam and say, hey, look, guys, jihad, slavery, a huge part of what, the Quran and the Hadith are all about. Hey, how about animal sacrifice? Let's throw that in too. Because, guys, it's 21st century. This has got to change. Most of the world's major religions really have no capacity for amendment. And because we use the word amendment in American politics so often, I think we forget just really what it means. But Buddhism is very radically and fundamentally open to amendment because it began as the most radical and fundamental attempt at amending the religions that existed before it in ancient India.